Got late. Thank you for the sub. Also, hi Eric. This is chapter 32, Enigma. As I became convinced that the involvement of an intruder in JonBenet's murder was not a viable possibility, I focused my attention on the members of the Ramsey family who were present in their home at the time of the murder. In this preceding chapter, I have narrated my thoughts on the statements and circumstances that suggest John or Patsy may have been involved. My review of the investigation revealed that little attention had been paid to Burke Ramsey's possible involvement in the events of December 25th and 26th. In this and in ensuing chapters, I address what we know about Burke and his circumstances at the critical times. My in-depth examination of that information, I believe, shows that a reach for the truth in this investigation requires a full inquiry into Burke's family and mental health history and his knowledge of the conduct on December 25th and 26th, 1996. My analysis of what we know now provides the beginning but no means the end of that inquiry. For the outset of this investigation, the Ramsey family appeared to have gone to great lengths to distance Burke from the Boulder police investigators. Rick French attempted to speak to him on the morning of the kidnapping as he was departing the residence with Fleet White. John Ramsey intervened and told the officer that Burke had been asleep and didn't know anything. Well, how would Ramsey know that? The family was repeatedly stated that they never woke him up on the morning to ask him anything about JonBenet's disappearance. Boulder investigators did get one preliminary opportunity to speak with Burke. However, the detective Fred Patterson had the foresight to scramble to the White residence not long after the discovery of JonBenet's body. This interview took place at approximately 3 p.m. on the afternoon of December 26, 1996, and a woman at the residence, identifying herself as Burke's grandmother, sat in on the interview. The transcript of that recording was the first glimpse I had into Burke's thought process. It is not clear whether Burke was aware that JonBenet had been found at the time that this interview was conducted, but throughout the questioning, I found it odd that he never once expressed concern for his little sister or asked about the status of the search for her. Quite the opposite was observed. Detective Patterson had to stop his interview at one point in order that Burke could finish eating a sandwich. Here was a police detective asking him about the disappearance of his sister, and he was so engrossed in the act of eating that he couldn't articulate his words with a mouthful of food. Patterson was able to elicit some details about events leading up to the kidnapping and was informed that Burke had played at home until around 4:30 to 5 on Christmas Day and had put on a sweater before heading to the White dinner party. He played and ate some sandwiches while there and stated that the family went directly home after the party. This conflicted with the statements offered by the parents, who reported that they had made two stops on the way home to deliver Christmas presents to the family friends. Burke stated that he had put on his PJs, brushed his teeth, and went to bed upon arriving home. He estimated this time frame to have been around 8:30 and 9 o'clock. The only noise he reported hearing after going to bed was the squeaking water heater. He did not hear any scream, cry, yell, or any raised voices during the night. Burke Ramsey provided conflicting information about waking. In one instance, he advised that he woke and his father told him about JonBenet being gone. In another instance, he advised Detective Patterson that his dad had awakened him and told him that his sister was missing and that they were going to find her. At the close of the interview, Burke again stated that he didn't hear any arguing between anyone the previous night. A red flag fluttered when I noted that Burke concluded the interview not with the question about the welfare of his missing sister, but with a comment about his excitement about going to Charlevoix. The anticipated being able to build a fire at the family's second home apparently held some appeal to him. It was an odd comment, and I concluded my reading of the last page of this transcript with more questions than what I had going in at page 1. How could Burke not be inquiring about the status or welfare of his missing sister? Was it conceivable that he already was aware of her fate? Detective Patterson's interview was the first of several that would eventually be conducted with Burke over the course of the investigation, and each provided some new insight into the enigma of this little boy. Sergeant Mason had attempted to arrange another interview with Burke during his brief visit to the Fernie residence on the evening of December 27th, but as with Patsy, Dr. Buff refused to allow that to occur. When the second interview was subsequently scheduled, it was conducted by a member of the Department of Social Services, the DSS, and not by a law enforcement officer. As I write this chapter, it occurs to me that I never asked anyone involved in the investigation how it came to pass that Burke was interviewed so early in the investigation and at a time when his parents were refusing to participate in follow-up interviews with police investigators. As noted previously, however, the interview had been one of the recommendations made by the Child Fatality Review Team that had been convened by the coroner on the afternoon of John Bonet's autopsy. So I have to presume that it had something to do with DSS protocols that requires the removal of siblings from the home in the event of a child's death. I suspect that the Ramseys capitulated to this second interview because they didn't want to give up temporary custody of their son to the Department of Social Services. At the family's insistence, the interview conducted on January 8, 1997, was performed only by personnel from DSS, and Dr. Susan Bernard was the sole adult in the room with Burke. She later provided her assessment of his reaction to events surrounding the kidnapping and murder of his sister to one of the Boulder investigators. There had been no transcript prepared for this interview, but a brief synopsis was written up by Dr. Jane Harmer after she spoke with Dr. Bernard. I read through the outline of dialogue that had been exchanged between Dr. Bernard and Burke and her assessment of the interview. She had expressed concerns about Burke's affect during the interview and indicated that he showed little emotional connection with his family. I came away wanting to know more. It took some time, but I eventually obtained a copy of the video of this interview, and I reviewed it on many occasions. I was troubled by what I saw. At one point during the interview, Dr. Bernard asked Burke if he felt safe in his home. There was no hesitation when he responded that yes, he felt safe at home and was not worried about the intruder returning. I thought it unusual that he would feel safe about his circumstances following the death of his sister. Here he was, probably 30 feet down the hall from her bedroom, when an intruder silently crept into his home and snatched his sister from her own bed and brutally tortured and murdered her within earshot of his family. There were other children and families in Boulder who were terribly afraid that they could be the next target of this monster, and Burke seemed not to give it a second thought. When asked key questions about sexual conduct, his body language exhibited signs of anxiety, and at one point he picked up a board game they were playing and rubbed it on his head. The display of this body language contrasted to the behavior exhibited as a baseline throughout other parts of the interview. On another occasion, Dr. Bernard had mistakenly taken a sip from Burke's soda can. He seemed to bristle at the intrusion of his personal space/property and indicated that he couldn't drink from that can anymore. I was taken aback by another comment offered during the playing of a board game. The nature of this game involved guessing the features of the faces hidden on the opponent's side of the game board. Burke had mistakenly flipped down the face of his side of the board and then returned it to an upright position, commenting, "Oops, you're not dead yet." This offhand comment seemed extremely callous and suggested little care or concern for the circumstances at hand. I would later think of that comment might have its source in the events surrounding the death of JonBenet. Dr. Bernard had also expressed concern about the family's portrait Burke had been asked to compose during the interview. She noted that JonBenet was conspicuously absent from the picture. It was Dr. Bernard's experience that many similarly situated children included dead relatives in their family portraits for years after their passing. It was an interesting contrast because it was reported that many of JonBenet's classmates had drawn pictures of her into their artwork when they attended a grief and counseling session hosted at her elementary school a couple days after her death. In Burke's situation, however, a week and a half after the brutal murder of his sister, he was now moving forward with his life, and JonBenet was no longer of importance. She had not been drawn into the family picture. Hardly the response I would have expected from a 9-year-old boy who had just lost a sibling to a violent death. Dr. Bernard also made note of the size of the figures representing Burke's parents and suggested that their small stature in the picture possibly signified an issue with emotional attachment. His father was pictured in the window of a cockpit of a distant plane, and she interpreted this to mean that Burke's father didn't play a significant role in his life and was viewed as distant and remote. His mother was smaller than the figure representing Burke's self-portrait, and Dr. Bernard thought that she didn't hold much sway or influence over him. I also thought it was interesting that Burke admitted to having secrets during the interview, but wouldn't reveal them to Dr. Bernard because then they would no longer be a secret. I had interviewed Dr. Bernard, now going under the name of Pinto, on the 1st of December 2005 because I was intrigued by the composition of the family portrait that Burke had been asked to draw and wanted to see it firsthand. Unfortunately, she did not have it in her possession, so I was never able to see it or secure a copy for the investigative files. We spoke of many things during the interview, but what concerned me the most was her continuing impression of the 9-year-old. She remembered that Burke had presented a flat, unemotional affect, and that he was closed down, and that she had a difficult time drawing information out of him. He seemed reticent to talk about his family, and she thought him very protective of them. It was her experience that kids usually talk more about their family relationships, and Burke was not displaying attachment to either his sister or parents. She commented on the fact that he had shed no tears when speaking about JonBenet's death. She went on to explain that that it was sometimes difficult for children to distinguish what to say and what not to say, especially when they were trying to hide something. I inquired about the picture that Burke had drawn of his family during their interview. She advised that it was difficult to interpret. The drawing represented a family that was not attached, and it raised questions for her about the typical behavior taking place in the household. I asked further about the indications of childhood personality disorders, and Dr. Bernard explained that anxiety such as that displayed by Burke at points in his interview comes from caring, and this type of behavior is not typically observed in sociopathic personalities. She indicated that some of Burke's behavior could more likely be indicative of a dysfunctional environment. While discussing the topic of childhood development, Dr. Bernard advised that bedwetting usually ends around the age of 3 to 4 years. If it continues into the 5th year, it is usually indicative of medical or emotionally issues being involved. Dr. Bernard had expressed concerns about having a follow-up interview with Burke because of the affect that he was exhibiting towards his family. They never took place, however, and apparently the one interview that DSS conducted with him on January 8, 1997, got the family off the hook. Burke was able to remain in the custody of his parents. There was one other troubling aspect of Burke's DSS interview that bears mention, but I need to provide another piece of information to place it into proper perspective. During my review of police reports, I came across the transcript of an interview conducted with Mary Ann Kempfer, whose son Anthony Paccio was a class and a friend of Burke. Anthony and his mother had been invited to accompany the Ramsey family to Atlanta for JonBenét's funeral services. Anthony to be a playmate for Burke. Kempfer, not knowing anyone in attendance, assumed the duty of being a nanny to the boys throughout the course of their stay in Georgia. Boulder police investigators, interested in a first-person account of what had transpired in Atlanta, interviewed Kempfer on the evening of her return from Georgia. She described Burke as being a very withdrawn little boy who didn't care much for hugs and would rather you leave him alone. While attending the memorial services in Boulder and while playing with Anthony in Atlanta, Burke was described by Anthony as acting like he kind of knew what happened and trusted that people would find out. Anthony indicated that Burke may have appeared confused at times, but was not acting upset and indicated that he was not scared. When asking how he was doing, Burke said he was doing fine. Anthony told investigators that he never saw Burke cry during their stay in Atlanta. Kempfer advised that the only time she had seen him display some emotion and sadness was at the cemetery after the graveside services. He had left a group of people and went to the side of JonBenét's casket, patting it gently. After the brief display of caring, Burke and Anthony went exploring, skipping through the headstones in the cemetery. Upon returning from Atlanta on January 2, 1997, Kempfer spoke to fellow parent Susan Stein and was told about a conversation Stein had overheard taking place between Burke and her son, Doug. This was reported to have taken place on the afternoon following the grief counseling session that had been hosted at JonBenét's school on the morning of Saturday, December 28, 1996. Stein appeared to Kempfer to have been disturbed by the conversation and had listened to Burke and Doug talk about how JonBenet had been strangled. Based upon Kempfer's statement, it appeared that Stein had overheard the boys discussing whether or not manual strangulation had been involved in JonBenet's death. Stein described the conversation as being very impersonal, and it struck her that the discussion about the details of JonBenet's death was like the boys were talking about a TV show. This discourse between Burke and Doug had taken place no more than 2 days following JonBenet's murder, and apparently had such an impact upon Stein that she brought it up in conversation with Mary Kempfer at the first opportunity. As I reviewed the video of the DSS interview between Dr. Bernard and Burke, he was asked if he knew what had happened to his sister or if he had talked to his parents about it. Burke stated that he knew what happened and indicated that he had asked his father where he had found JonBenet's body. His father had told him that she had been found in the basement. During the initial exploration of this topic, Burke again appeared to be exhibiting signs of discomfort and stress. As displayed during the question about sexual contact, he began rubbing the board game on his head and was holding it in front of his face. He eventually put the board down. When asked again what he thought had happened, Burke advised without hesitation that he knew what had happened to to JonBenét and that she had been killed. He stated that he thought someone had quietly carried her downstairs to the basement and that that person had either stabbed JonBenét or struck a blow to her head with the hammer. A chill ran down the back of my neck as I watched Burke twice physically imitate the act of striking a blow with his right arm during this casual discussion on the matter. I stopped and replayed this section of video several times. It seemed absolutely incredible, but Burke Ramsey was replicating the exact type of over-the-arm blow that would have been responsible for the head injury sustained by JonBenét. It is difficult to describe what I'm experiencing. I flashed to the scene of a photograph that I had seen depicting John Ramsey standing next to JonBenét and Burke on a sandy beach. The three of them were standing next to one another, nearly arm in arm, and they appeared to be enjoying a summer vacation. Burke stood head and shoulder above his little sister, and it was the difference in their height that struck me at that moment. JonBenét seemed so petite standing next to her brother, and the mechanics of the delivery of a lethal blow to her head appeared to be within the realm of possibilities. I leaned back in my chair and contemplated the scene I had just witnessed on the DSS video. There were red flags popping up all over the place, and I wondered why, assuming Burke had not been misled himself, he apparently would feel it necessary to mislead Dr. Bernard about his knowledge of the circumstances surrounding the death of his sister and the possibility that a stabbing was involved. As I reviewed the video time and time again, I found it noteworthy that Burke never once mentioned the fact that he knew that JonBenét had been strangled during this conversation with Dr. Bernard. As noted, Burke's interview with Dr. Bernard took place a little less than a week and a half after JonBenét's murder on January 8, 1997. The fact that JonBenét had been strangled was common knowledge in Boulder by that juncture. The Daily Camera's first published article that reported on the news of the kidnap and the murder of JonBenét was released to the public on the morning of December 27, 1996. It was noted in the article that the autopsy of JonBenét had not yet been conducted, but was expected to be performed sometime that day. Chief Tom Colby told the reporter that although the official cause of death was not yet known, the case was considered a homicide. Detective Sergeant Larry Mason was quoted as saying that the child had not been shot or stabbed. The fact that JonBenét had been strangled wouldn't be released by the papers until the following day on December 28th, but the exact details about the manner in which the strangulation had taken place were not released. I thought it noteworthy that neither one of these first two newspaper articles mentioned any blow to JonBenét's head, and I wondered how Burke could have known about that injury. I would later find through research of the news media coverage that the Boulder Daily Camera would make passing comment about a head injury a few days later. But a full detail of the depressed skull fracture wouldn't be revealed to the public by the Boulder County coroner until July 1997. The first public mention of any type of head injury appeared to have been reported by the Daily Camera in an article published on January 6, 1997, and reads as follows. John Ramsey and a friend later found JonBenét strangled in the basement. The killer had sexually assaulted the girl, covered her mouth with duct tape, looped a nylon cord around her neck, and fractured her skull. I considered the possibility that this early release of information could have been the source of Burke's speculation about the hammer strike to his sister's head, but he had combined the comment with his mention of a stabbing as well. Why speculate about two methods of injury if he was truly conversant with his sister's injuries? I spoke to the media people who were more closely associated with the daily reporting of events at the time and became aware that some minor references regarding the injury to JonBenet's skull had also been discussed by retired FBI agent John Douglas on Dateline NBC on the evening of January 28, 1997. As noted previously, Douglas had been hired by the Ramsey family and subsequently provided a profile of the person believed responsible for the abduction and murder of their daughter. The Dateline NBC interviewer Chris Hansen attributed the following statement to John Douglas during a voiceover of the program. Hansen: Douglas says JonBenet was brutalized and she had duct tape on her mouth. She suffered severe head wounds and she was strangled and sexually assaulted. The late date of this public broadcast didn't explain Burke's reference to the head injury. However, and I attempted to determine what exactly had been known by the family in advance of Burke's DSS interview. The Ramseys were not conversing with Boulder investigators at the time, so I reached the conclusion that as the parents of a murdered child, members of either the coroner's office or the DA's office were probably sharing this information with the Ramsey attorneys. I thought it was likely that they were advised of this information fairly early in the investigation and long before it became general public knowledge. The parents had maintained that they never spoke to their son about the circumstances surrounding JonBenet's death and had indicated over the following months that they had made every effort to limit his exposure to the media coverage taking place about the murder. At one point, Patsy had actually asked the manager of a supermarket to remove the tabloid newspapers from the racks of the business. She didn't want her son to be confronted with the type of sensationalist coverage of the murder while waiting in the checkout line of the grocery store. I again thought it feasible that he may have overheard his parents talking between themselves about the head injury. Or, similar to the conversation he had with Doug Stein about the strangulation, Burke may have been conversing about the details of the investigation with playmates and learned of the head injury prior to the DSS interview. This was certainly within the realm of possibilities, but I was still asking myself the following questions. Why would Burke tell Dr. Bernard that he knew what had happened to JonBenet and not mentioned her strangulation? He clearly was aware that strangulation had involved due to the conversations he was overheard having with Doug Stein not more than 2 days after the murder of his sister. Additionally, if Burke had truly become aware of the circumstances surrounding the murder, why would he be mentioning a stabbing when there was no such injury sustained by his sister? As illustrated here, the first media report issued on the murder specifically stated that JonBenet had not been stabbed. Those were troubling questions, and I wondered whether Burke deliberately misled Dr. Bernard regarding the exact knowledge he had of the circumstances surrounding his sister's death and why he would feel the need to do so. Taking all of these things into consideration, I wondered if perhaps this was merely another strange coincidence that would continue to muddy the waters of the investigation. On the other hand, I couldn't help but contemplate the possibility that Burke had just physically demonstrated first-hand knowledge of the lethal blow that had been struck to the head of JonBenet. Boulder police investigators were effectively being sidelined by late spring of 1998, and the DA's office had successfully negotiated another series of interviews with the Ramsey family. The fact that a grand jury investigation was looming seemed to play a role in getting the Ramseys back to the interview table, but this time the man who had given birth to the intruder theory would be directly involved. Boulder police were aware that interviews were going to take place, but the DA's office would not reveal where they would occur. Investigators were provided the opportunity. However, the review of the videotapes between the interviews that had been scheduled over the span of three days in June of 1998. Transcripts of the interviews conducted with John and Patsy Ramsey had subsequently been prepared, but I couldn't find any written record of the interviews conducted with Burke. I was eventually able to obtain DVD copies of those videotapes. It was my impression that Burke continued to display a distant and detached attitude toward the events surrounding JonBenet's death, and he frequently appeared bored by the investigators' questions. When queries finally began to center around the details of his sister's disappearance, Burke retreated into his chair in a fetal-like position, and he seemed to become agitated and nervous. Again, I thought this body language seemed to suggest anxiety and distress. I had initially thought that he might have been withdrawing unconsciously into the position of a fetal production, but later observed that he was calling out that the hour of the interview was nearing an end. This to me resembled the behavior of a reluctant psychiatric patient monitoring the clock for the conclusion of a counseling session. I was not able to review the third and final segments of these interviews due to a faulty DVD disc, but I was advised by Tom Wickman that at the conclusion of the last interview, Burke was asked if he had any questions regarding the investigation into the death of his sister. Provided this opportunity, did Burke inquire whether the police were any closer to catching the person who had brutally murdered his sister? No. He asked instead if the brand of wristwatch being worn by the detective was a Rolex. The demeanor and continued lack of effect exhibited by Burke Ramsey during this series of interviews was unsettling. It appeared to me that he had no interest whatsoever in the progress of the investigation regarding the death of his sister. Another item of interest that came to my attention were issues that related to Burke's late age of bedwetting. A short-term housekeeper had reported to police investigators that Burke was having problems urinating in bed in 1993, and the parents were having problems with him at the time. Burke seemed reluctant to acknowledge the extent of the issue to Dr. Bernard during the DSS interview in early January 1997. Let me again make it perfectly clear. I was not proposing that what little we knew demonstrated that Burke was a sociopathic or had a personality disorder. I was not proposing that what little we knew demonstrated that Burke was sociopathic or had a personality disorder. I fully realized that more than this was needed to prove any theory of his involvement, but at the time those were red flags that began to pique my interest as I continued my review of investigative files. I had discovered during my review of the case files, with the apparent consent of prosecutors, there were medical records that Ramsey attorneys withheld from the district attorney's office in 1998, and I believed it conceivable that they spoke to the very issue of family involvement and a cover-up regarding the circumstances of JonBenet's death. If the family was involved in any fashion, I believe those records were key to solving the mystery of this child's death, and it was one of the leads I had attempted to convince Mary Lacey to pursue in January 2006. There was one more peculiar aspect to Burke's outward behavior that left me uneasy. At one juncture during my tenure at the DA's office, I met with Tom Trujillo, and we were going over some materials in one of the investigative binders at his office. We happened upon 3 individual Polaroid photographs of Burke and his parents. I had previously seen duplicates of these in the DA's files. I asked Trujillo about them, and he informed me that he had taken the photographs on the afternoon of Saturday, December 28, 1996, when he was collecting non-testimonial evidence from members of the family. I took a few moments to silently study each of the photographs. John Ramsey looked tired, haggard, and despondent. Patsy Ramsey was hard to recognize. Her hair was pulled back tightly against her head. She was pale and without makeup and looked as though she had aged 100 years. The beautiful woman I had seen in many other photographs was barely recognizable, and there was no doubt in my mind that she was consumed by anguish. Like his parents, Burke was seated in a chair, and he leaned back slightly with his right arm slung casually over a nearby table. Burke looked directly into the lens and smiled for the camera. It was puzzling. Here he was, providing handwriting exemplars, fingerprints and DNA samples to police investigators in their investigation into the murder of his sister. It had to be a stressful and extremely painful time for everyone. I couldn't help but wonder why Burke Ramsey was smiling. That's all I got for you today.